And when I thought about this, I decided it was really a story of consolidation and then exploration, and definitely was an evolution rather than a revolution, and I'm prepared to fight for that. And so I'm going to be mainly speaking about public services, which is where most of my work has been, and then I will also mention one particular tool that I've mainly worked in, but really as an illustration of how lean tools can develop and evolve both in and outside of a lean environment. So first of all, consolidation, and this is quite UK based because it gives a kind of whole history within one country, but you'll see that it's probably reflected in other countries as well. I know a lot of these organisations that I'm going to mention have sister organisations and are well connected overseas. So the first aspect of consolidation was sectoral initiatives, and there's a whole load of logos that are going to come up here, and as I was meeting people at the beginning, I could almost line up the people who represented those logos at the front here. The sectoral initiative that I became involved in, how I actually got employed with LERC, was through Industry Forum. And I know some of you were trained and employees of Industry Forum, and probably many of you were encountered them maybe through training or meeting or having a look at their training materials. And it was a really interesting initiative because it occurred because Honda, Nissan and Toyota came and built plants in the UK, and part of their contract was they had to use the automotive supply chain. What they found was the automotive supply chain wasn't sufficiently well skilled to meet their quality standards. And so the Department of Trade and Industry started an initiative with the Trade Association for the automotive sector. And it was the first time those three companies had ever worked together. And it had to be quite diplomatically negotiated to come up with a standard way of doing things. And I've still got the file on my bookcase at home of their kind of standard way of doing things. I don't know if you two still have. And it was, you know, really saying, we're going to have a standard op for our implementation, and it was reviewed every year. So they applied that continuous improvement to their own methods. But it wasn't the only sectoral initiative. It was copied into aerospace, almost a direct copy, and then other sectors evolved that. And here's some examples: the metal industries and the processing industries, and you might well know of other industries as well. I've also mentioned the Ministry of Defence, who took a different approach. So the Ministry of Defence decided they wanted to implement all sorts of lean ideas, despite not being a manufacturer of anything. And here at LERC, we were involved in two ways. We were subcontracted by the University of Warwick, do you remember, John? And we would go and teach lean ideas to the Defence Logistics Organisation. And then we also did another course at Trivenham. One of the reasons we couldn't do it on a military base is because different ranks were not allowed to eat together. So in order for them to eat together, we had to do it about 5 miles down the road at a hotel. One of those mad rules that you get in public sector organisations. But it was really interesting engaging with these types of organisations who don't have that, we're a shareholder, they're thinking about public value and what that means. And we'll come back to that a little bit later on. So other types of consolidation were the type of training that you could get. And lean competency system was obviously invented by Simon. I remember the meeting where he suggested this idea, and he said, we want black belts for lean. And I went away and kind of put the initial kind of flesh on that bone, and then Simon's kind of taken it on and really made a comprehensive business and a framework whereby people know what they're employing and they know what they're getting with their training. And so it formalised some of those ideas that people wanted. At the same time, to become a chartered engineer now, you also need to know about some lean ideas. I know because I wrote the requirements. But it's focused more on quality and continuous improvement. It doesn't actually mention lean in the specifications. And then there are also university courses, and I mentioned the University of Buckingham because it happens to be one that I'm familiar with, and they do courses at masters, bachelors, and I believe they're also developing an apprentice level as well. And you can go and pay your money, you can take that on, and some great students they produce as well. And in terms of opportunities, these are much broader than they used to be. So when I was putting together this presentation, I looked at Indeed, the job website, which you may be familiar with, and I typed in lean to see how many opportunities were. Over 5,000. That wouldn't have been there 20 years ago. The word wouldn't have been familiar, the companies wouldn't have been asking for it. And I thought, well, I just want to check these out actually proper lean and they know what they're asking for. So I had a look at a few of the adverts, and you can see the kind of companies who are now asking for lean skills. Amazon, IKEA, PepsiCo. I quite fancied that one. They own Walker's Crisps, a brand that's dear to us in Leicester, but this one was actually making Monster Munch, which probably sounds more fun than it actually is. So there's loads. If you want to get into lean nowadays, there's lots of things you can do that are much more, you know what you're getting, other people know what you're getting, it's much more part of what life is like in the UK and all around the world. And so that marks the consolidation of lean ideas. And what I want to talk about next is the consolidation in terms of application from public service mainly. And this next slide is a very complicated one, so I'm going to take some of it out. It's a copy from one of my PhD students, a guy called Russ Glennon, who wasn't particularly looking at lean. What he was looking at was performance measurement in local government. And probably you may not realise how much lean ideas have permeated into government, both at national and at local level. I'm just going to take some of these out so it's a bit more readable. Now, what you can see on here is it's just time over here, okay? And it covers the Blair governments and then the coalition. At the top here, we've got the kind of ways of thinking, and these are kind of academic frameworks that some of you may have heard about, like public value, new public governance. But then he's got the kind of management instruments that occurred, and these were things that would have been implemented at national and local government level. And one of the biggest ones of those is lean and transformation. You can see it covers the longest time period, and is a later kind of addition to this. By the way, the background that was earlier in the slide is all the white papers and government initiatives that he logged over time. I wanted him to have it made into a kind of tea towel for us keen lean people. But before these lean ideas, you can also see some of the elements of lean that we're familiar with. So there's performance measurement, so speak with data, use of data to inform decision making, TQM and a process focus, and also the idea of value. And this is particularly important in public sector organisations, because value is a lot more complicated than it would be in other environments. You've got a multi-stakeholder environment, often conflicting. You haven't got customers, you've got service users. Some of these service users are reluctant service users, say in the criminal justice system. So what you're trying to achieve in terms of value is much more complex than it would be in another environment. So on the next slide, I just want to talk a little bit about other public sector organisations. And at Loughborough, as part of the Centre for Service Management, we were commissioned by the Institute for Continuous Improvement in Public Service to kind of say, what's the current state of continuous improvement in public service? Now, I want you to note the change of language here. They're not talking about lean, they're talking about continuous improvement. But when we spoke to these organisations, they were synonymous in their own minds. And what they'd done a survey, and they wanted us to analyse it, and then we went in to look at 7 of these organisations, and we did a case study in each of those. I think And they were police services, they were health services, they were education. I think one or two of those organisations are actually represented here, but they remain anonymous in here. So what we found was that they used the tools that are common both in private companies and also in public organisations, and you'll be familiar with all of these tools. I was particularly pleased to see the digital management come up as the most popular because it's an area where I do my own focus. But there are things here which you associate more with lean, and in fact lean generally was one of the criteria that people mentioned. What we also found was these organisations had problems with implementation that are common across just about all organisations. So lack of leadership, staff resistance, lack of cohesive strategy, the same old nutshells that I think have already been mentioned to some extent, and I'm sure will be mentioned again. Something that came out that I don't think is peculiar to public sector organisations, but came out for these organisations in particular, was where to cite their, in this case, continuous improvement, but could be lean skills. And it was whether to have a central expertise whereby, so like a lean office, and the advantages of this is that you get an esprit de corps. You know, it's nice to work with similar thinking people, and you can have a centre of expertise whereby you can do the very best for your organisation. So why did organisations want a distributed approach? This meant locally represented continuous improvement people. And the reason for that is that you then get local responsibility for continuous improvement and local sensitivity to context specific. From looking at this, we were unable to conclude if there was one model that was best. And what we found was a lot of organisations went from one to the other and back again as their needs changed over time. What I conclude is you probably need a bit of each, but actually the local responsibility is what you'll need long term to make sure that people actually really take these ideas on board. Another aspect that came out particularly in the public sector was to do with quantifying benefits. Now, this is a theme I'll return to right at the end, but it was always a problem for public sector organisations, particularly under a cost-constrained environment. I remember these organisations were living through an austerity agenda. And also there was a more kind of ethical issue, which is we're dealing with public money and we have to be able to say that what we're doing is the right thing to do. So we could put our efforts here and we could put our efforts here, and we need to be able to justify that in this complex stakeholder environment where we've got to be thinking about public value. And then as my final sort of general public service, I wanted to briefly mention the Royal Air Force. So at LERC we were also commissioned by the Royal Air Force, who were implementing a lot of lean ideas. And they had very expensive consultants in, and they wanted a bit of kind of someone on their side, a bit of hand-holding. And so that's what we did. But we then did some research thinking, kind of pulling on from what John said about the halo effect, say, do these lean ideas apply well in this public sector environment? And so we thought about those fundamental lean principles of value, flow, pull, and so on. We thought, how well do they work? And our conclusion was, they all work really well, surprisingly, except the idea of pull is a bit of a misnomer. The reason for that is when you're thinking about physical products, you can pull them from a manufacturing system. But with a service, often the person, or in the form of health, patient, is self-presenting. And if you think about it, in the postal system, you're actually physically pushing in your parcel into a letterbox. And so the idea of pull didn't work so well. The idea did, but the name didn't. I can give you an example of that. So this is for a diagram that we used for the Royal Air Force for a future state for how they service their equipment. They have a pool of in-use equipment. In this case, they were Tornadoes. And Tornadoes are modular. You kind of take bits off, you know, so you have the engines and the airframes and so on. And you have to push them in to a queue for the diagnostic. And this can be scheduled, like your car maintenance, or it can be when something starts to go wrong. They can be then scrapped, and that's, again, a push, but you can then pair and pull from that diagnostic. Then you can put repair. It can then get into a pull of equipment, which is then pulled back into the in-service equipment. But you still have to have this push element here. And so we had to start, and that's why you have a decoupling point there, which I'm sure you'll be familiar with. And so you had to replace the idea of pull by the idea of demand readiness. And this works very well in other public service and other service organisations where you don't have a physical product and you're providing a service to someone who is self-presenting. Okay, so I've mentioned health, and I particularly wanted to focus on the sector of health because this is the sector that I believe is doing the most interesting work to evolve lean ideas. And I've been a bit involved with some health organisations, and I wanted to highlight a couple. One is the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. I put their website up here, and also there's a link in here. I don't know if it will come through in your electronic slides. So the Institute for Healthcare Improvement do all sorts of improvement activities, but if you have a look at the tools that they've got available on their website, and it's a brilliant resource. I use it for my own students, so I use this specific YouTube clip, which is about how to use a run charts data to inform your decision making. And they've kind of put a veneer of health on it, but it's actually about the travel time to the hospital rather than anything else. But it's beautifully done and really well explained and really engaging for all sorts of people. And there's just so much resource that's been put here and so much that's available and well thought out that everybody who wants to do kind of lean training should be looking in places like this. And also they're taking these ideas forward. A second organisation I wanted to mention was this institute, which is a slightly strange name, but I actually went to their conference this time last week. And their purpose is to strengthen the evidence base for improving healthcare. And you may be thinking, well, what does this mean in lean terms? And I was talking to one of the delegates last night about this. We met up in one of the hotels. And basically what they're doing is just like I mentioned with Industry Forum, they're improving the process of improvement. And the comment, I can't see where you were, it was very meta, was the comment about it. So this is really saying, how can these ideas of improvement be made better themselves? Because we all know within organisations, people grasp these, we need something to help us do this better. But it's about saying these particular tools that we've got out there, how can we implement them better? How can we gather together a robust evidence base to manage this? So the health sector has adopted and rethought lean ideas to result in its own version and lexicon. And what I mean by this is that you very rarely hear the word lean within healthcare. And last week at this institute, there were so many lean ideas flying around and hardly any words that we would use in a more traditional lean environment were used. They've rethought them, and part of that rethinking is renaming, and new ideas are emerging as a consequence. So there's been a move away from that lean terminology. If you have a look online, there's Productive Ward and the NHS Improvement Hub, loads of lean resources there available for us, and you would absolutely recognise these as core lean ideas. In terms of what they call it, sometimes they call it improvement science. It's in fact moving away from that as a term towards improvement studies, and you're noticing how this language is evolving, and also the additional ideas that go along with that are also evolving. So health is extending lean ideas and its associated tools and techniques, both by research but practice as well. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of these. So this is a research example from another one of my PhD students, Igor Leet, and he was looking at implementing lean in Brazil. Brazil was interesting as it was it's a BRICS country. It has a public health system, not unlike the NHS. It's free at the point of use. At the time, Brazil was prospering, hence they were sending out all sorts of PhD students all around the world. They're having a bit more difficulty now. And so they were looking to improve their health sector. It has some specific challenges in that it's a very large country with some very densely populated areas and also some very sparsely populated areas. So he was looking at what are the barriers to implementing lean in my country. I'm not really expecting you to be able to read this. What this diagram shows is these are the barriers to implementing lean in a Brazilian health system, and they're very much what you might expect, like lack of commitment, and for those of you who are familiar with health, lack of commitment from different professional sectors, lack of coherent strategy, lack of resources, the usual things that we might expect. Now, what he realised was these are really well documented in the literature. Why is that? Why don't, these are fairly well-known things. And he started to think, well, think of these as ostensible barriers. So these are things that are obvious. And what he wanted to do was to say, well, what causes these? And that's what kind of lies underneath here. So these are the underlying barriers. Now, some of you who are familiar with the lean iceberg diagram, which I think Pauline found is an author of, she's here somewhere, can't see her. Right, oh right, there's little hands up over there. It's very similar in idea. But what it shows is that it applies beyond health, and it's a demonstration of how health thinks through some of these deeper ideas. And when you're frustrated in your own organisations, you probably need to reflect, what are my underlying barriers? What's causing all these types of traditional resistance? And so this nicely demonstrates the deeper thinking that is required to progress lean implementation. The final example I wanted to show in healthcare was looking at visual management. Some of you may know it's an area of focus for me. And this particular picture shows orthopedic mapping, and you'll probably recognise it. For any of you who've ever done any big picture mapping, it is very familiar. This next slide will probably be familiar to anyone who's been into certainly NHS healthcare, but many other healthcare around the world. It's similar to a sort of team communication board for a cell, and it's a board for planning care. And what it does is it tells you about the current status of a ward in a health environment. So much so similar to what we might expect outside of a health environment, in a kind of standard lean environment. But I wanted to show this last slide, which has emerged out of the healthcare sector. It's an example of much more conceptual thinking. And these were people who were not lean trained at all. They were aware of these kinds of approaches up here. It's for my local NHS trust in Leicester. And what it shows is how they wanted to conceptualise some of their healthcare challenges. In this case, frailty and multimorbidity. For those of you who don't know, multimorbidity, you have 5 or more things that can kill you at once. So you can see how this engages with an older population, which is a challenge for all healthcare and all societies around the world. And it looks at a shallow level a bit like a kind of flow diagram or a big picture map or value stream map, but that's not how it was used. what it was used for was saying, this is how we want to approach the idea of frailty. It allowed people to, like visual tools do, to quickly understand what other people were thinking about the idea. But one of the advantages of these visual tools is it allows people to quickly contribute and say, no, we should be doing this. You can grab a pen and you can start writing on it. One of the people who involved in this said it was a little bit like sitting around a campfire and discussing the idea, but it acted as a vehicle to allow them to quickly conceptualize their ideas. Now, this is important because it allows the idea of co-creation to take place. Using these visual tools means that you can quickly understand what other people are saying, grasp that, and you can grab the pen and start adding your own ideas to that, and that's done in a very concise way. And I was thinking, well, this hasn't come from a lean basis, but it's kind of allied and thinking about what do we mean by value, but it goes a little bit beyond that in many ways. And I can see it echoes the kind of what do we mean by value conversations that you have when you start to do a value stream map, but it has a broader remit. And so I liked it as an example of how healthcare takes lean ideas and runs with them and turns them into something else. One of the challenges we have as a community is, what do we call this? Is it lean? Is it not lean? They don't want to call it lean. Do we want to claim it? Don't know. So I'm going to carry on with a little bit more on visual management. And this is an example of how a tool that mainly emerged in lean has evolved and exists outside lean environments as well. But I got into visual management because I believed it was fundamental to continuous improvement. What I also like about it now is it uses little data. John mentioned the big data, but it's also about taking care of what locally happens near you that you can actually influence. It's about noticing those little details and saying, what can we do about this? So what I was trying to do was, how do we make visual management better? A lot of visual management has been taken from practitioners, and I knew there was a lot of research that we could apply, particularly from graphic designers and from cognitive psychology. And so using those, I started to do my research. And my first kind of large piece of work was designing some visual management principles for improving the design of communication boards. And here is an example of a communication board with a company called Assa Abloy, who make locks for all sorts of sectors, quite a big company. They probably made every lock in this building. I haven't checked yet, but they almost certainly did. They had a very good lean pedigree. They really knew what they were doing, but they were aware that their team leaders, like this is Lynn here, who's in front of her newly designed board, weren't really engaging with problem solving and continuous improvement. And so I didn't put all the literature that I could find and threw into my own ideas and developed some visual management principles. For those of you who are interested, there's some reference at the end where you can pick those up, or I have a hard copy as well. They're quite easy to implement and understand as well. And so they implemented them, rolled them out over time, and they found it worked pretty well. They're very happy with it. It wasn't without some teething problems. But from this, we then gone on to do, the latest research is has been done by my PhD student, who's gone from a case study to an experimental environment. So what he's done is he's taken these visual management principles and he's designed a business problem, and then he's shown the same problem using different formats. He's got teams of people testing with one format and we're testing with the same data with another format. So, and he's just putting that together, and hopefully he'll be having his Viva kind of in the spring. He's just slogging away writing it all up. But what happened with these, so he did 15 different teams comparing different formats. He videoed what they were doing, and then he spoke to them and said, how did you find it? What worked well? What was difficult? And the principles that he checked were the layout of the board. So this is about having a board that reflects the flow of the conversation that you want to have. So if these ideas are often these pieces of data need to be compared frequently, put them together. If you want to encourage conversations that take this and this together, put them close to each other. If you want the agenda to be this, this and this, put those items next to each other so that the inferences that you might gain by comparing data is supported by the layout of the board. And this is the one that came out the most strongly. So we had different layouts with the same data, and this was the one that caused the biggest difference in terms of the performance of the team, and also caused them to take more time in terms of understanding what they were trying to, understanding in problem solving. He also checked status indicators, so that these are the red, amber, green status indicators that I'm sure you'll come across. And what he found was in this format, they don't seem to make any difference. If anything, they make people lazy because they don't interrogate the data properly. They just look for the reds and ignore the rest. Now, it might be different where you've got 20 or 30 things to look at a more strategic level or a high level. But for this particular format, they don't help. There was also, interestingly, no strong preference for graphs, tables. People seemed to cope whatever. One or two people said, I just prefer it to do it the way that I do it now. So if you're an accountant, you tend to look at tables. If you're more operations, you tend to look more at graphs. But it didn't seem to make a massive amount of difference. So that's just emerging. And the next area, so this is to look at analog versus digital. So this is what I would describe as an analog communications board. And I would count whiteboard versions in analog as well. And there's a very strong drive to go, now we can get these big smart boards. There isn't one in here, but they are becoming more common, certainly are in our primary schools. My daughter was amazed when she was in primary school that we didn't have these at our workplaces. But now these big format smart boards are available. There's a strong drive to put these kinds of boards in that arena. But there is no evidence, and I have looked quite hard, if you have it, please tell me, there is no evidence that paper or digital is better or worse. People who work in the field, shop floor people, tend to prefer the paper-based format. And there are some arguments that you could put towards that in that analog approach is more approachable for people. You grab the pen, you don't have to understand the software, you don't have to boot up a bit of equipment. It works better in slightly rougher environments where it might be wet. But there are arguments for digital as well, because it means that nobody's got to fill in the board. That means they might not engage with the data so much, but it also means that you can get a single source of accurate data much more easily, and it's more likely to be updated. It also works well for taking, if you want to gather the data from lots of localized areas back to a central source and aggregate that. However, we don't have any evidence, and so that's the area that I want to work in next, and I'm just developing some trials based on Peter's work, comparing the two formats. And if anybody wants to talk to me afterwards about it, if you want to take part or join in with that in some way. And so I was just going to summarize what all this means. And so we've got consolidation in Lean. We've got these institutions and formalized frameworks which allow us to know where we stand, to know what we should be doing, and the great tools and techniques out there for us to pick up. We've shown wide application of these ideas from its core within the vehicle manufacturer to all different sorts of sectors that we never imagined in the first place. We can see how that is now being explored into a wider range of areas, and how that's the application in different sectors means that new ideas are evolving. What this means for the future, I wanted to kind of present in a kind of grand theory. Sadly, I don't have one, so I'm just going to put a few ideas that could maybe form a grand theory or at least shape for what we want to do in the future. So this is what I drew out from this kind of retrospective, was that there are consistently hard nuts to crack, which are about leadership, resistance, change, strategy, all that kind of stuff that have been there for years and years and years. And it's kind of, I think we came through a little bit in John's talk and maybe the questions afterwards is, so why haven't we cracked them? I think because they're difficult, they're fundamentally difficult and require hard work and effort. And let's face it, there's always other things that need to be done in a business environment. I believe that we actually have to go back to general management thinking to solve these problems. And we need to engage with the change specialists, the HRM people, the strategists, and so on. And we don't need to reinvent the wheel as a lean community. We need to go back and say, what's out there that can help us? I mentioned right at the beginning about accounting in public sector, but this goes beyond the public sector. Now, I know there are lean accounting approaches out there, but they are not adopted by the accounting organisations like CIMA and CIPFA. There is no, for those of you who know accounting will know what this means. GAP with 2 A's stands for Generally Accepted Accounting Practice, and there isn't a lean one. Unless anyone would like to tell me about it, but as far as I know, it doesn't exist. It's not what's taught to our accountants in universities, and it should be. We should have a good way, a standard, recognised way of doing lean accounting. It is possible, but it's just not adopted by those accounting professional institutions, and it needs to be. The specific tools associated with lean, and visual management is an example, can live both in lean but also outside of that. And we can draw ideas from that and take them back into lean ideas. And we don't have to be too snooty about where they came from. And it's an active area and there's much work to be done. And quite often I'm doing visual management in organisations who don't really know lean, but they are doing it unknowingly. And that kind of brings me to my last point in a moment. I'll return to. So we've seen how health has embraced lean and evolved and adapted it to its own needs under new names. And that brings me to my final point. And maybe this will be something that comes out of this conference today, which is we need to have a think as a lean community about what is lean and what isn't. How are we going to cope with these adaptations? Has lean become so commonplace that it's just part of goods management and doesn't have a separate name? Should we say ring fence it and say this is lean and this is not? Or should we say this is near like lean and we accept that and we're a broad church? I think it's something as a community of practitioners and academics we need to show leadership on. Because I see so much wasted energy saying what is lean and what isn't, and we should be a bit more authoritative on this and set an idea. I don't know what we should set. I think that's something we should talk about together, but that's the way that I think we should go to establish the future of lean for future people. Thank you very much. I don't think precious is quite the right word. People can get a bit huffy, can't they? And you know, one company comes with its tray of lean approaches, another one comes and they have a big fight about it, and you know, I think that's kind of not the point. But I mean, it was interesting you mentioned consultants, because what consultants do is they bring new ideas and help organisations implement things, but they also have to name things and refresh things, and you know, lean has been around for a long time, and what it gets called new things. So one of these ideas that came about is the idea of operating model, which I was involved with. Now, as far as I'm concerned, operating model is just the design of a lean system, but it still emerged as a thing. And you need to think, well, how do these relate together? It would be kind of quite nice to kind of have a map of how it all sits together. I mean, that's how I And of course, these things don't emerge from thin air. You know, you can see that a lot of these ideas were based on what the Royal Navy, sorry, different service, had had evolved 200 years before, and you can follow that through the history sheets. And you know, a lot of good ideas have very solid foundations, and that's why I think maybe having a very hard ring fence is not a good idea. But also, we need to say this is what we conceive of lean. These are maybe lean ideas that are close to that. And how's it going in Tornado? Well, Tornado is not an aircraft anymore. Yeah. It definitely is an open space. Interestingly, Assa Abloy went to a more digital version, but they want to revisit it as well. There's some excellent books by Few who talks about dashboards, and quite often these are digital. But I would really like to engage with them and make them better. I see a whole bunch of flaws in what's out there, and I'd like to do it in a better way. I'm sure there's lots of opportunity for doing that. It is often the case, and for public sector organisations, it's a really complex, question. When I'm arresting Sarah for whatever, who's the stakeholder in this? It's you guys who she's just done an armed raid on or whatever, but it's also other people's well-being, the people she's stolen their jewels from, and so on. So it's not a straightforward answer, and that's why co-creation of these public services is so important. Yeah, the webcam approach is certainly a good one, and been tried in lots of places. But our role as academics is to research and try new stuff. So it'd be nice to kind of say that way is definitely better because of this, this, and this. Thank you very much.